For more on this, we're joined by Anupam Manur, a professor of economics at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome back to the programme, Professor. Now, India is extending tax exemptions through 2041 to give global hardware makers long-term fiscal certainty. How significantly will this improve India's cost competitiveness against rival manufacturing hubs like Vietnam and China?
Yes, it does help at the margin. And what genuinely matters is the time horizon. The original exemption ran until 2031, which is just 5 years from now. And this is not enough time for the returns on the capital expenditure it was meant to invite. Essentially, the window was too short to plan large, long term investments. Now, however, with the exemption, I think 15 years seems long enough that a firm can actually plan around it. However, this is a much narrower fix and corrects a slightly self-inflicted harm. You see, when a brand owner ships tooling to a contract manufacturer, the international position is that this shouldn't create a taxable presence. But India did otherwise and is now merely correcting it. So this is a real improvement, but it's a tax hygiene rather than a competitive edge.
Right, and contract partners like Foxconn and Tata are rapidly scaling up domestic facilities. Will these extended tax breaks be sufficient to encourage sub-tier component suppliers to move their primary supply chains to India as well?
No, I don't think we can oversell this policy move, as good as it is. The exemption addresses the brand owner's tax exposure on machinery. It does nothing for the economics a component supplier faces while deciding whether to build a plant in India or not. That decision will be based on scale, on duty-free access to their own inputs, and on being close to a dense supplier base. Also, this exemption operates only through customs bonded warehouses, which are areas technically outside India's customs border. That structure exists because India's tariff wall makes ordinary importing quite expensive. So, given that there is no visible change to the overall trade and manufacturing ecosystem, it might not do much to pull in component manufacturers into India.
And beyond tax incentives, what structural reforms can New Delhi implement to ensure these capital investments translate into long-term growth?
Yeah, there are quite a few things, obviously, that India can and must focus on, but I'll try to limit it to just 2 or 3 items. The first one is tariffs. The government is subsidizing electronics assembly through incentive schemes while taxing the components that that assembly needs. So then it builds these bonded enclaves to escape the tariffs. So cutting component and capital goods duties would do more than any other exemption that we can think of, and that would help every sector, not just one. Second, make tax certainty structural rather than transactional. So, if we broadly agree that this is a move in the right direction, why limit it to 2041, which will invite fresh lobbying again in perhaps 2038 or 2039? So, this should be made a permanent feature. Third, and I think this is the slightly boring and repetitive economics answer, which is that we need structural argument, right? Which is structural reforms. So we need to reform land and labor along with providing reliable power and water.
And with India projected to assemble over a quarter of the world's iPhones this year, how are rising geopolitical trade tensions influencing where multinational tech giants locate their high-tech manufacturing capacity?
Yeah, we just need to look at a little bit of history here. So India went from about 6% of global iPhone shipment in 2022 to 22% in 2025 and around 26% this year, as you mentioned earlier. So most of that happened before this exemptions existed. So firms were already diversifying because of concentration risk had become an important survival question. There is an acknowledgement of this even in the government's draft bill. It cites evolving geopolitical developments and disruptions in trade and supply chains as the main reason behind this move. So there's one thing that deserves attention here, though. Final assembly can relocate rather quickly, but entire supply chains don't necessarily relocate. So 26% of iPhones are assembled in India, but most of what goes into them arrives from elsewhere, largely China, where the risk still exists. So reducing dependence needs more than just relocating assembly.
Right, interesting analysis there, Professor Anupam Manur from the Takshashila Institution. Thank you very much as always.